The coin didn't look like much cheap plastic red as a toy stop sign sitting alone on the concrete by the furnace. But when I bent to pick it up, the wall behind the ducts exhaled a thin draft across my wrist, warm as breath in February air. I told myself the old house was settling. Then, something somewhere in the bricks seemed to remember my name. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I used to time my mornings by the bus routes and the bakery ovens. In St. Paul, you learn the rhythm of a street, the way you learn a lullaby, delivery trucks at 5:15 a.m., first customers at 6 Huzurs, the city waking in layers. I'd lace up my shoes before sunrise, pour coffee into a travel mug that never kept the heat as long as it promised, and check the hospice schedule glowing on my phone. Medication checks, family calls, the quiet rituals of care that turn ordinary days into something sturdy. My patients taught me to measure time by breath, not by hour, slow and steady out count to 4 between. It's a good way to live until the past decides it wants a different pace. On the coldest nights when the furnace in my apartment clicked and sighed, I'd think about a different furnace miles north of the city, the one tucked into the back corner of our old farmhouse past the boxes of Christmas lights and the creaking shelves that smelled like mouse-chewed cardboard. When I left Briar Lake at 18, I promised myself I'd keep those rooms in the soft part of my memory oval rag rug in the hallway tall clock that hadn't chimed since the year the twins won the porch, where you could see deer step out of the tree line if you held your breath and didn't blink. Some places deserve to be remembered kindly. I did my best. Back then, Briar Lake wasn't on any map tourists carried. A 2-pump station, a diner that served meatloaf every day but Sunday, and a main street that turned to gravel after the post office. In winter, snow packed hard along the shoulders of the county road and turned the ditches into white bowls. You could smell wood smoke by the mile. Folks waved from their steering wheels even when they didn't know your name. 2 fingers lifted just enough to say, "We see you." The lake itself wasn't much a long oval with cattails at the far end, and a dock that had a permanent list like an old man leaning to hear better. If you were born there, you learned to skate on black ice that sang, and to spot a storm by the way the poplars went dull before the wind hit. Our house sat a half-mile off Larkspur Road, farther than the county plow came on a good day. My father liked it that way. He said a long driveway taught you to plan ahead, stack the wood in August chains on by Thanksgiving, keep a shovel in the truck. We had a big kitchen with a scarred table and chair legs that wore their own grooves into the oak floor. Every winter, my mother pinned quilts across the drafty back door and jammed a rolled towel beneath the threshold. She once said the place sang when the temperature fell below 10, the wind found its notes, and the siding carried them. It was a comforting idea then. Jason was the type of kid who could turn a cardboard box into a ferry boat and a flashlight into the lighthouse that saved it. He hated heavy coats and loved any game that let him keep a running tally chips, counted fence posts, counted songs, counted without words until he clapped twice and started again. If he woke early, he'd climb onto the radiator by the kitchen window with his socks half on and fog up the glass with his breath drawing stick-figure deer in the white, until my mother shooed him off and handed him toast. He would not eat until the butter had cooled. He collected odd things, cereal box tokens, soda caps, marble chips dug out of the driveway. He lined them in a row along the windowsill and named each one like a small congregation. My mother had a voice that could lift or lower the temperature in a room without changing volume. Margaret could make a greeting sound like an invitation or a warning. On Saturdays, she tied her hair back with a shoelace she kept in the junk drawer and washed the wide farmhouse sink with a sponge that always smelled faintly like lemons. She kept her wedding band on a nail above the stove so it wouldn't catch when she kneaded bread. I used to think that Ring watched our kitchen like a clock. When someone knocked, she'd swipe her hands on a dish towel and say your name before you crossed the threshold as if the house had whispered it to her in advance. Walt Hale lived up on the rise where the county road curved. He had a plow welded to the front of an old blue pickup, and a way of arriving before the snow did like the storm had phoned him first. Walt liked to bring tomatoes the size of softballs come August and a 5-gallon gas can when he knew my father had misjudged the woodpile. He'd lean one elbow on the tailgate and talk about the high school team as if he'd stepped off the field 10 minutes prior, not 50 years. He could fix a hinge with baling wire and a prayer. In our part of Minnesota, a neighbor like that makes a house feel taller. Michael Holbrook wasn't from Briar Lake. He came down from Duluth in a van with a dented side panel and clean hands twice a year by the calendar. My father swore by him for the furnace and the water heater. Michael had an old-school thermos stamped with a faded pine tree and a habit of tapping a wall with his knuckles, the way a doctor taps a knee listening for something just beneath the surface. If the wind was wrong, he'd park closer to the porch so the tools wouldn't freeze before he reached the cellar door. He wasn't a talker. People who fix things rarely are not until something needs saying. I left Briar Lake the way a person folds a letter and tucks it in a book kept, but not in reach. College first, then nursing school, then the kind of work that requires steady hands and a voice that knows how to be quiet. I learned the laws of small mercies, warm blankets, honest answers sitting in the chair closest to the bed. What I didn't learn was how to cancel the way a certain temperature can call up a memory without asking your permission. 28. Minnesota winters will teach you new snow from old snow dry, cold from wet cold. But the first time the air hits just right, you're back on a stair that creaks in a pitch you haven't heard in years, holding a flashlight you forgot you owned. I kept up good habits. Sunday calls with my mother. Cards at Christmas, signed in her neat print, "Love Mom," as if neatness could make the space between us smaller. When my father passed, I drove north in a rental with wipers that never kept pace with the sleet. We packed his tools in boxes marked by hand, the ink blurring where snow touched cardboard. We told ourselves we'd decide what to do with the place in the spring, a season we invoked like a promise. Spring came and went twice before we said it again. Time moves differently on the old county road. The mailbox loosens on one bolt, the porch paint lifts in ribbons, a shutter tilts just enough to make the whole front of the house look like it's listening. You don't notice the changes if you stop by every week. You notice when you return after a long while and some small angle is wrong. A chair that should face the window faces the wall. A mat has been turned. An Afghan sits folded on the couch with the fringe tucked in too carefully the way a stranger might stage it. It's nothing. And then it isn't. My work carries a kind of discipline. Write what you learn, record what you see. Let silence be a tool rather than a punishment. When you call families at dawn and dusk, you hear a house wake up and go to sleep. You learn everyone's version of footsteps and what they mean. You learn when a heater sounds honest and when it sounds like it's memorizing something it shouldn't. In my apartment, the furnace hum is clean and bright. On the phone with my mother, winter nights carried a second tone faint off to the side, like air moving through a place it didn't used to have permission to be. The day the letter arrived wasn't remarkable. Cold, but not cruel. Tgesev by noon, a white haze over the river salt hardened into gray cakes along the curb. I'd just signed for a package of disposable hot packs and a fresh cuff for a sphygmomanometer. The mail was thin a flyer for gutters. I didn't need a bank statement that never told me anything I didn't already know, and one envelope with my full name written in a hand that didn't belong to my mother, but understood the shape of my name anyway. It was unsealed. That felt worse than if it had been pasted shut. I set it on the counter, washed my hands out of habit, and stood there feeling the old itch between my shoulder blades that says you've forgotten something important in the next room. I didn't open it right then. I put a pot on for soup, turned the burner low, and called a patient's daughter to talk about the new schedule. I made notes. I rinsed the spoon and set it on a paper towel to keep from marking the counter. These are the small things that make a day survivable. The envelope stayed on the edge of my vision like a bookmark jutting from a book you pretend you're not reading. When I finally slid the paper free, I braced for paragraphs for dates and names and the kind of instruction that tells you where to be and when. It wasn't that. It was a handful of words that made the kitchen feel too warm. I don't know how long I stood there after. Long enough for the soup to form skin, long enough for the radiator to chatter and quiet again. I folded the paper once and slid it into the pocket of my coat, where a person might keep a ticket she's afraid to lose. Then I pulled the storage bin down from the top shelf of the closet, the one with school photos tucked into their plastic sleeves, and the kind of Polaroids that lock color into faces even as they fade around the edges. Somewhere in that box, a boy grinned with 2 front teeth too big for his face, holding out a plastic coin like it was hard currency. I laid the picture on the counter. I don't believe in omens, but I believe in evidence. Sometimes they're the same thing. Briar Lake doesn't change the way cities do. It shrinks without announcement. People go and don't come back. The diner shortens its hours and swaps pie crust for crumble because the cook's hands don't care for cold lard anymore. The county cuts a plow route and says it's not personal. The lake, stubborn as ever, still freezes from the shore inward, leaving a black seam in the middle that tempts teenagers to test their weight. I drove north the next morning with 2 thermoses and a bag of road pretzels too salty by half. The highway gave way to 2 lanes, then to one that followed a stand of pines like a ribbon slipped between pages. The sky took its pale winter shade, the one that makes distance seem closer and closer seem far. There's a particular quiet that lives on the porch of a country house in winter. It isn't empty. It carries tire crackle a quarter-mile off, and deer stepping through the brush and the soft hiss of snow as it falls through warmer air near the roof. The porch boards had gone gray since I'd last stood there. The light fixture over the door had a globe of ice around it where a leak caught and froze. My key still turned, though the hinge stuttered like it was embarrassed to see me. The air smelled like cedar and dust, and a hint of iron the way an old radiator smells when it wakes after a long sleep. I set my bag down and listened. Houses tell you how they've been. This one asked me to wait. My mother kept the kitchen as if a person might step in at any moment and ask for coffee. 2 mugs on the shelf. A dish towel folded on the oven handle with the corners squared. The tall clock against the wall carried a thin veil of flour she must have baked or meant to. Sunlight came in sideways through the window over the sink and turned the steam from the kettle into a pale ribbon. I stood where I'd stood 1,000 times and felt my shoulders drop in a way they hadn't in months. Home is stubborn that way. It takes you in even when you arrive with bad weather in your pocket. Later, I wandered the rooms like a nurse on night rounds, checking the quiet the way I check a pulse. The west hallway had always held a chill that wasn't just draft, but it felt sharper now, like the air had learned a new trick. The guest room at the end was a fraction off curtain, turned a dust shadow on the floor where a chair used to sit. My father's study smelled the same pencil shavings and cold paper, even with the desk empty of what mattered. In the living room, the mantel kept its little congregation of framed faces, the glass cloudy with age. A photo of Jason, crooked in its frame, leaned forward, as if trying to climb out to see better. I straightened it out of reflex and stepped back. Sometimes a small correction makes the whole room breathe easier. Dusk comes early in February. Light thins fast, and the road turns from gray to the color of a bruise. I turned on the porch light out of habit. In a town like ours, a porch light says we're here. It says you won't have to knock twice. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in the space of a cup of tea. I could feel it along the floorboards, like water creeping. In the kitchen, the thermostat clicked, but the flame in the furnace didn't answer right away, a pause so slight a stranger wouldn't have noticed. I noticed. The pause held long enough to let the house choose a sound. When the heat finally came, It rose through the vents in a slow ribbon, carrying with it the faintest noise, the kind of gentle, steady exhale you hear when someone is almost asleep. I stood very still and listened for the phone to ring, for headlights to sweep across the wall, for a door to close upstairs where no one had walked. None of it came. The porch light burned a little too bright for the hour, and the wind left the pines untouched, as if the night had decided to wait with me. The furnace hesitated again that night, the way a person does before saying something they shouldn't. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a half-drunk cup of tea and the kind of quiet that only country houses know, thick old full of memory. I kept the porch light on just to have something moving in the corner of my eye, that pale halo on snow. My mother had gone to bed an hour earlier. She always said the house stayed warmer if someone kept the kettle hot, so I did. When the pipes groaned, I told myself it was air in the line. But then the sound settled low beneath the floorboards, steady and rhythmic, not random at all. It felt like the house was breathing again, the same way I remembered from that summer so long ago. I set my cup down and just listened, waiting for it to stop, waiting for it to mean nothing. By morning, the world outside had gone silver with frost. The fields were smooth as tin, and the trees stood in white lace, not moving. I'd barely slept, half expecting some shift in the night footsteps wind. Anything but the house had gone still right before dawn. I made coffee, strong and bitter, and stood at the kitchen window watching the driveway. At 9:13, the knock came. It startled me because no one ever knocked out here. The sound carried through the frame like someone had struck a heartbeat into the wood. When I opened the door, a man stood there bundled in an old tan parka and gloves worn thin at the palms. His face was one of those that carries its own weather, a man built for the cold. He smiled the way small-town men do, polite but uncertain. "Elaine Carter?" he asked. I nodded, though it had been a long time since anyone used my full name. "Didn't think you'd remember me." "Walt Hale. I live up on Ridge Lane." The name fit the memory. I saw him then 28 years younger, laughing beside my father, a glove tucked in his back pocket. I remember I said, "You used to plow our drive." He chuckled softly. "And give your brother those ugly green tomatoes he never ate." That made me smile, though it came out brittle. He stepped closer, his breath curling in the cold. "Saw your car last night. Figured you came back for a reason." I hesitated, the letter heavy in my coat pocket. Finally I said, "Someone sent me a note." He waited, eyes sharp but kind. "Said he's still here. Behind the furnace." The wind shifted, then a soft scrape of ice across the porch rail, and Walt's face changed. The kind of change that doesn't need words. He looked past me toward the hall that led to the basement door. "You ever hear a house breathe?" "Elaine?" I blinked at him. "Breathe." He nodded slowly. "I know it sounds strange, but I helped your dad with that furnace years ago. Every fall before the freeze, we'd check it. Room was always too warm, even when the heat was off. And when you stood by that back wall, it felt hollow, like there was something behind it." I felt a prickle along my arms that had nothing to do with the cold. "Did you tell him that I asked?" "Once," he said. He smiled and said, "Every old place has secrets." Walt's gaze moved past my shoulder again. "When the boy went missing, I thought about that room. But folks didn't want theories back then. They wanted hope." His voice softened. "I never believed Jason ran off. Not without shoes. Not out here." He sipped the coffee I'd offered him, eyes fixed on the table between us. Then he reached into his coat and unfolded a brittle newspaper clipping, edges yellow as old parchment. June 5th, 1997. Local boy still missing. But someone had circled a name in red ink, Michael Holbrook, maintenance contractor, missing 2 days later. I stared at the name, my stomach turning cold. "I don't remember this," I whispered. Most people don't, Walt said. But 2 people went missing that week, not 1. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly thinner. He slid the clipping toward me, then stood. If you're going to look in that basement, don't go alone. He left the rest unsaid. I watched his truck rattle down the road until the sound faded. Then I looked at the clipping again. The red circle bled slightly where the ink had soaked the paper like someone had drawn it in a hurry or with a shaking hand. By afternoon, the snow came soft and steady. I spent those hours in the dining room, surrounded by photo boxes and loose papers that smelled like cedar and dust. The old diagram of the house caught my eye, one of my father's sketches from the 70s drawn in careful lines. Basement layout, it read. And behind the furnace, a rectangle labeled storage tunnel sealed. My pulse quickened. I traced the ink with my finger until it smudged faintly. I remembered that room, the warped door, the chain my father had looped across it after the flood. They said the police couldn't open it back then. They said nothing was behind it, but if there was a tunnel, that wasn't true. I climbed the stairs to my mother's room. She sat on the edge of her bed with a quilt around her shoulders, watching snow drift past the window. I held up the photo I'd found earlier, Dad beside a tall man with a thermos and tool belt, both smiling at the camera. This him, I asked. Her eyes flicked to the photo, then back to me. Michael, she said softly. He worked the furnace. Why I showed her the clipping. He disappeared the same week Jason did. She looked older in that moment than her 74 years, her voice thin as tissue. He was a quiet man. Came twice a year. That spring he said something felt off with the furnace room. Not mechanical. He said the heat was wrong, the air was wrong. He used the word breathing. I sat down beside her. And Dad. He laughed. Said Michael had been reading too many ghost stories. But 3 days before Jason disappeared, Michael came back. Wanted another look. Jack told him no. She closed her eyes. And then we lost your brother. The house creaked under a gust of wind, and both of us froze for a moment listening. I didn't say it aloud, but I felt sure of something. Michael Holbrook hadn't gone missing by chance. He'd gone back. When night came, the temperature dropped hard. The kind of cold that makes wood sound brittle. I stood at the top of the basement stairs with a flashlight and a hammer the way I had once stood there as a child, daring myself to go 2 steps down. The smell that rose up was old and damp, touched by iron and time. I could hear the furnace ticking softly, even though it wasn't running, as if it remembered the habit. The bulb above the stairwell still worked dim and yellow, casting long bars of shadow. I moved slow, my steps echoing off the concrete like small warnings. At the back of the basement, the furnace stood hulking and still pipes curling over it like veins. And there it was, the door to the utility room, chained and warped paint, bubbled from years of damp heat. The flashlight beam wavered as I moved closer. There was a print on the wood, small, low to the ground, just above the handle, the size of a child's hand. I knelt, touched it lightly. The dust flaked beneath my fingers. It wasn't old. I backed away slowly until my shoulder hit a stack of boxes. For a long minute I just stood there, the air thick and warm around me, the kind of warmth that doesn't come from heat but from breath. Then I climbed the stairs without turning off the light. The next morning I called the Briar Lake Library and asked for the archives. The voice that answered was familiar Helen Orville, who'd once been my 6th grade teacher. Elaine Carter, she said, surprised. I haven't heard that name in years. I asked about property records, anything from before 1950. She offered to meet me that afternoon. When I walked in, the library smelled of old paper and lemon wax. Helen sat behind the desk, a small tower of ledgers beside her. Your family's land goes back farther than most think, she said, flipping through brittle pages. Before your folks, it belonged to a man named Elias Granger. Ran a home for boys out here, unofficial, not state-run. Closed after a fire in '26. "What kind of home?" I asked. "Troubled youth, they called it," she said carefully. Records mention a root cellar collapse underground. They bricked it up and sold the land. New farmhouse built right over the foundation. She met my eyes then. "Your farmhouse." The ledger between us smelled faintly of smoke. "What happened to the boys?" I asked. Helen shook her head. "Records don't say. People didn't keep those kinds of notes back then." Back at the house, I spread my father's basement diagram next to the library map. The lines matched the sealed tunnel sat exactly where the old root cellar had been. My stomach clenched as I realized the furnace wall wasn't just a patch job. It was a lid. I went down again before dusk. The light from the small basement window was blue and thin. When I laid my palm against the wall behind the furnace, it was warmer than the rest, and it gave just slightly under the pressure of my hand, like something soft beneath the stone. I stepped back fast. The air shifted around me. No sound, just a sense that the room had listened. Upstairs, I heard the faint scrape of a step. I called out, but my mother didn't answer. The hallway was empty when I reached it. On the porch rail outside, I noticed something glinting. A small brass button, tarnished but still bright enough to catch light. I turned it over in my hand. Someone had scratched initials into the underside, MH. My throat went dry. I closed my fingers around it and went back inside. That night I dreamed of the basement, the hum of warmth pressed against stone, a whisper I couldn't place. In the dream, Jason stood barefoot in the corner holding his red coin up to the light. When I woke, the kettle was cold and the house silent again, the kind of silence that feels like it's listening for you to speak first. I made a promise then, not out loud, not to anyone else, but to the boy whose smile still hung crooked in that frame on the mantel. Tomorrow I'd break through that wall and see what had been waiting behind our furnace all these years. The morning light came thin through the frost on the kitchen window, dull and gray, the kind that doesn't warm a room so much as remind you how cold it is. I'd slept maybe an hour. The rest of the night I sat in that creaking chair by the stove staring at the basement door like it might open on its own. When the kettle began to hum, I realized my hand was still wrapped around the brass button I'd found on the porch rail. I kept turning it over between my fingers until the edge left a faint groove in my skin. MH. I could see the letters in my mind even with my eyes closed. I'd told myself it had to be Michael's, a coat button, maybe dropped decades ago. But then I remembered the fresh fingerprint on the basement door, and that excuse didn't hold. Not anymore. I don't know what made me call Helen again that morning, habit maybe, or the simple need to hear another voice. The phone rang twice before she answered, warm as ever, but cautious like she'd been expecting bad news. I asked if she could check any employment or service records tied to the old Granger property before it became our farm. She hesitated. "That far back, the paper trail's thin," she said. "But I'll look." Before she hung up, her tone shifted slightly. "Elaine," she added, "be careful down there. That land's seen more stories than it ought to." By midday, the sky had gone pale again, a flat sheet of white that hid the sun completely. I bundled up, grabbed my gloves, flashlight, and the hammer I'd left by the stairs. The basement light flickered once when I switched it on, as if thinking it over. Dust hung in the air, drifting through the beam like slow snow. The furnace sat quiet, a heavy shape in the far corner. I pulled at the chain across the door until the old links rattled loose. The wood groaned but gave a little under pressure, so I worked slow, hitting the hinges one at a time until the latch cracked free. Warm air rolled out, not furnace, warm, but body, warm, dense, and faintly sweet. The room beyond was smaller than I remembered, maybe 6 feet by 10 walls of stone patched with rough brick. My father's old wrench still hung on a nail by the doorway, rusted to the color of dried blood. The furnace loomed to the left, silent but not cold. I could feel a low thrum beneath my feet, too steady for imagination. Behind it, where the blueprints had marked the tunnel, the wall was darker than the rest. I crouched down and ran the flashlight beam across the surface. That's when I saw them scratches, faint but deliberate, a tangle of lines carved into the mortar. They looked like someone had clawed or chiseled at the wall in panic, but higher up near eye level, the marks became words. 2 letters. JC. I froze. My knees hit the floor before I realized I'd dropped down, fingers tracing those letters through the dust. Jason Carter. My brother. I don't know how long I stayed down there. Long enough for my flashlight battery to fade, long enough for my breath to fog the lens. When I finally stepped back, I noticed something else in the corner. Something that didn't belong. A hairline crack running vertical through the bricks wide enough to slip the edge of a coin into. I reached up and pressed my palm flat against it. The warmth pulsed through stone and skin, rhythmic, almost gentle. I pulled my hand away like I'd touched a burner. There was movement behind that wall. Slow, deliberate movement. That night, the air in the house felt heavier. The wind outside had died down, yet the walls made small noises, ticks and sighs as if expanding in unseen heat. My mother stayed mostly upstairs, drifting between naps. But when she came down for tea, she seemed thinner, her eyes distant. "You've been in the cellar," she said, not accusing, just stating it like a fact she'd been waiting to hear. I nodded. "There's something behind that furnace," I told her. "It's warm. There are marks, Jason's initials." She set her cup down carefully, her hands trembling just enough to ripple the surface. "He was afraid of that room," she whispered. "He said it talked to him." I didn't answer right away. The clock over the sink ticked unevenly, the minute hand pausing every few seconds like it was deciding whether to move forward. My mother's voice came again, soft but steady. "Your father knew," she said. "He found a draft once behind the wall. Said he'd fix it after the thaw. Then Michael came back, said the air in that room wasn't right. It was too thick, too alive." She stopped herself, looking up sharply. "You should leave it be." I wanted to tell her I would, but that wasn't true. After she went to bed, I took the flashlight and sat at the top of the stairs again, listening. The hum was faint, but constant, like the slow breathing of a large animal asleep behind the stone. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes, it was nearly dawn, and the light filtering through the window above the sink had that colorless early tint that makes everything look like a photograph. The furnace had stopped humming. The silence was worse. I needed proof of what I'd felt. Something solid. Something more than memory. I packed the camera from my car and drove to town to a hardware store that still sold plaster drills and old-style chisels. The man behind the counter didn't ask why I needed them. Around here, folks learn not to ask questions they don't want answered. On the way back, I stopped at Walt's. His truck was parked out front, the bed half full of sandbags. When he opened the door, his expression told me he'd been expecting me. "You found something, didn't you?" he said. I just nodded. He studied my face for a long moment, then grabbed his coat. "All right, let's have a look." We went down together around mid-morning. The furnace light flickered when we opened the door as if startled. Walt crouched near the base of the wall and rapped his knuckles against the stone. The sound came back wrong hollow, exactly like he'd said days before. "That's not solid fill," he murmured. "Someone patched this by hand." I showed him the letters, the scratches, the warmth that had seeped through the mortar. He leaned close, his breath clouding the wall. "Feels like air moving behind it," he said quietly. Then he turned to me. "Whatever's in there, you need to be ready." We started with the edge nearest the floor, chipping slow, letting each flake fall into a bucket so the noise wouldn't carry too far. The mortar crumbled faster than either of us expected, almost soft from moisture. By the time we pulled out the first brick, a gust of warm air pushed through the crack hard enough to blow dust into our faces. It smelled like earth, and something faintly sweet like syrup or old wood. Walt stepped back fast. "That's not furnace heat," he said. I nodded. My flashlight caught the darkness beyond a narrow slit of space-rough walls and deeper black stretching past it. The air trembled faintly, and then it came a single knock, slow and hollow from somewhere inside that dark. I think both of us stopped breathing for a moment. "That's the house settling," I whispered, though my voice didn't sound right even to me. Walt looked at me with eyes that didn't blink. "That wasn't the house," he said. He dropped the crowbar, and the sound echoed too long, as if the basement itself were wider than before. We sealed the door that night with what we had 2 nails and a heavy chair wedged beneath the handle. I knew it wouldn't hold if something wanted to come through, but it gave me the illusion of control, and sometimes that's all a person needs to get through until morning. My mother didn't ask what we'd done, though. When I came upstairs, she was sitting in the dark, awake, her hands folded in her lap. "You heard it too," I said. She nodded once, eyes on the floor. Every night since the letter came, she whispered. I didn't sleep at all. Every creak in the wood, every tick of the clock, every sigh from the vents felt amplified. Just before dawn, I wrote down everything I could remember. The dates, the names, the diagram of the basement, even the sound of that single knock, because if the story was going to start unraveling again, I needed a record of how it began. I kept the brass button beside the paper, its edges catching the faintest glint of morning light. The next afternoon, the power cut out. Not the neighborhood, just us. The furnace shut down with a long exhale, and for a moment, the silence in the house was complete. Then, from somewhere beneath the floorboards, came a soft shuffle, like footsteps on dust. I called out for my mother. No answer. I went to the top of the stairs, hand tight on the banister. The basement light was off, but something moved below, faint and deliberate. My throat went dry. When I stepped down, the air felt thicker with each step, warmer, like walking into breath. Halfway down, I stopped. There, in the dark, just past the reach of my flashlight, something tapped twice against the wall, measured calm, almost polite. I backed up slow, one step at a time, never taking my eyes off the doorway until I reached the top. I shut the door, turned the latch, and leaned my weight against it. The wood was warm beneath my palm. And behind that warmth, steady as a heartbeat, the house began to breathe again. When the house finally went quiet, it was the kind of quiet that hums against your ribs, the kind that has shape and weight to it. I sat on the stairs until the light changed from gray to amber, just watching the slats of sunlight crawl across the floor. I'd told myself I wouldn't go back down there until morning, but by sunrise I already knew I'd be standing in front of that wall again. There are moments when fear stops being sharp and starts feeling like responsibility, like something you have to face because no one else will. Walt showed up right after breakfast with a headlamp, a crowbar, and a bag of tools that looked older than either of us. He didn't say much, just asked if I had coffee on and if the lights had flickered again overnight. I told him no, though I hadn't slept long enough to notice. My mother watched from the doorway as we pulled on gloves. She didn't try to stop us this time. She just said, "Don't make it angry," and turned away. I wanted to ask what she meant, but Walt had already started down the stairs. The air in the basement hit me the same way it had before, dense and close, carrying that faint sweetness that never came from any furnace I've known. Dust shimmered in the beam of the lantern as we set up. Walt tapped the wall with the handle of the crowbar. "Different mortar," he muttered. "Whoever patched this wasn't a mason." He pressed his hand flat against the bricks and frowned. "You feel that?" I did. The warmth pulsed like something alive behind it. "This isn't air," he said quietly. "It's heat memory residual." I didn't know what that meant, but his tone made me colder than the room itself. We worked slow. Walt wedged the edge of the bar under a loose brick near the floor, and I steadied the lantern. The sound of the first crack echoed like a shot, though it shouldn't have been that loud. Dust puffed out, and the smell came stronger, earth metal, something almost sweet beneath it. "That's not right," Walt whispered. He pried again, and the second brick came free. A small gust of warm air rushed through the opening, quick enough to lift my hair from my face. I flinched back, coughing. "That's not furnace air," he said again, voice tight now. The flashlight beam wavered as I lifted it to the gap. Darkness beyond, but not still. There was motion, small and slow, like heat rippling over water. We kept going. The mortar crumbled fast once the first few bricks were out. Beneath the fourth row, a cavity appeared wide enough for an arm, maybe more. Walt crouched, peering in. "Looks like a tunnel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I knelt beside him and aimed the light through the gap. The beam vanished into open space, hitting a wall of packed dirt only a few feet beyond. Between us and that dirt was a small wooden box, half buried its surface, blackened but intact. Walt reached in carefully and pulled it out. It was no bigger than a lunch pail with rusted hinges and something rattling inside. He laid it on the ground, took a deep breath, and opened it. Inside was waxed cloth, folded neat. When he unwrapped it, what fell into his palm didn't make sense at first. Small white rounded shapes. Teeth. Children's teeth. My breath caught so hard it made my chest ache. Walt stared at them, expression unreadable. "What in God's name?" he whispered. I stepped back, hand over my mouth. It wasn't shock exactly, it was recognition. I'd seen teeth like that before, years ago when Jason lost one the week before he disappeared. I remembered him holding it in his palm, grinning, saying he'd keep it safe. The memory hit so hard I felt dizzy. "We need to stop," I said, but my voice sounded distant, muffled, like I was hearing it through a wall. Walt didn't answer. He reached in again and pulled out a second object, thin and metallic. It was a key, old, ornate, corroded in places, but still strong. A frayed bit of what might have been ribbon clung to it. He turned it over in his hand. "Doesn't look like any house key I've seen," he said. I could barely hear him. The air felt thicker now, warmer. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. "There's something else," Walt said, leaning closer to the gap. He peered inside, then pulled back fast, his face pale. "There's writing in there," he whispered. "Carved into the wall." I leaned in beside him, my shoulder brushing cold brick. The light caught faint letters scratched into stone. I could only make out the first line. "Don't open it unless you're ready to leave something behind." We stared at it for a long time, neither of us speaking. Then Walt slowly straightened the crowbar hanging loose in his hand. "I think we've done enough for today," he said, his voice quiet. I wanted to agree, but something deeper in me already knew I wasn't done. Not until I understood what Jason's initials were doing behind that wall, not until I knew why the air still breathed. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, the key in front of me, its metal catching the lamplight. My mother came in after midnight, wrapped in her shawl. She looked at the key, then at me, and I saw something shift in her face, a recognition that ran deeper than fear. "You found it?" she said softly. I asked what she meant. She took a long breath before answering. "When your brother disappeared," she said, "a man came to the house a few days before. He said he could fix what was happening in the furnace room. Said the house wasn't haunted, just remembering. He asked your father for that key." Her voice cracked a little. "Your father told him no. The next day the man was gone." I stared at her, my chest tight. "Michael Holbrook?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "He said the wall wanted stories, that it fed on them." The lights flickered once, then a faint dimming across the ceiling. My mother's eyes darted toward the hall. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. I did. The faint sound of air moving under the floorboards, rhythmic and patient. "It's always strongest before the full moon," she said, her voice distant now. "That's when it remembers best." I didn't ask how she knew. I think part of me didn't want to hear the answer. I stayed awake until dawn, reading through every page of Michael's old journal we'd found in the attic the week before, the one I hadn't had the courage to open until now. The entries were neat, methodical, the handwriting small and careful. The early notes were technical, but near the end they changed. "The wall is breathing again," one read. I heard something like a rhythm waiting. The last entry stopped me cold. The boy asked if the wall was alive. I told him no. I shouldn't have lied. Below it, scrawled in a different hand, were 3 words: "Let it forget." By late morning, I'd made up my mind. Whatever waited behind that wall, whatever had taken my brother and kept breathing for nearly 3 decades, I needed to see it. Not for answers, not even for closure, just to end the waiting. When Walt arrived around 10, I didn't ask him if he'd come to help. He just looked at me, saw the decision written all over my face, and went to fetch the crowbar. We worked in silence. The bricks came out cleaner this time, the mortar soft from years of hidden moisture. The air that poured through the widening gap was hot, the kind of heat that feels alive on skin. Walt aimed his lantern inside, and I crouched beside him. The tunnel stretched maybe 8 feet, walls rough and uneven, ceiling low enough to force a crouch. At the far end, something glinted, metal or glass, I couldn't tell. I took a step forward, the warmth wrapping around me like thick cloth. Walt reached for my shoulder. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "Yes, I do." I told him and ducked inside. The earth brushed my shoulders as I moved. The smell was stronger here, a blend of old stone decay and something faintly sweet, almost floral. My light flicked over markings carved into the wall, names, dozens of them, old and new, some half-faded, others fresh enough that dust still clung to the edges. Near the center, I saw 2. I recognized Emser Holbrook, 1997, and J. Carter. Beneath them, a 3rd name had been started but not finished, only the letter E. I stopped breathing. A soft sound came from deeper in a shuffle of movement like fabric against dirt. The air pulsed slower now, as if aware of me. I should have backed away, but instead I whispered, "Jason." The name barely made a sound, but the moment it left my lips, the tunnel answered with a low exhale of warm air that moved my hair against my cheek. The walls felt like they tightened slightly around me. I saw something then near the back, an outline pressed into the dirt, small and narrow, the size of a child curled on his side. The impression was faint, but the detail too precise to mistake fingers, ribs, the curve of a shoulder. I reached toward it, my hand shaking, and touched the edge of the imprint. The warmth there was almost human. For an instant, I thought I heard a voice, not with my ears exactly, but somewhere behind them, soft and familiar. "You stopped looking." I pulled my hand back like I'd been burned. The lantern behind me flickered once, twice, then steadied. Walt called my name, his voice muffled. I crawled backward fast, the tunnel air pressing against me like breath from an open mouth. When I stepped back into the furnace room, I couldn't speak. Walt looked at me, his face pale and lined. "What did you see?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just turned off the lantern, letting the room fall into shadow. The warmth on my skin lingered long after the air had gone still. Upstairs, the house creaked, softly settling or maybe remembering. I knew then that whatever was behind that wall wasn't done with me. It had waited this long, and now it knew I was listening. I didn't leave the farmhouse for 2 days after that night. Walt stayed for a while, sleeping in his truck by the drive, saying he'd rather listen to the wind out there than to the house breathe through the walls. I understood what he meant. The sound had changed again, no longer the low, rhythmic hum I'd grown used to. It was softer now, slower, like a body easing itself into rest. I spent that first night sitting in the kitchen, the lantern burning low, listening to it fade. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps upstairs, light almost childlike, but I stopped chasing sounds a long time ago. Whatever had been trapped in that tunnel, it wasn't angry anymore. It was tired. The next morning, the air felt different. I don't know how else to explain it. The cold didn't settle the same way. Even the snow on the porch rail looked looser, untouched. I walked the hallway and stopped at the top of the basement stairs. The latch was warm beneath my fingers, not feverish like before, just faintly alive. I opened it slowly. The furnace room was still the floor covered in dust and small piles of crumbled brick. Where the tunnel had been, there was only a clean wall, smooth plaster from floor to ceiling, as if it had never been opened. The marks were gone, the initials too. Only the air still carried that trace of warmth, the kind you feel in the palm of your hand after holding someone else's. I don't remember hearing my mother come down behind me, but when I turned, she was standing there, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "It's over," she said, voice steady, but her eyes didn't look at me. They looked past me to the furnace. I think she was waiting to hear it breathe again. It didn't. She stepped closer, touched the doorframe like it was something sacred, and whispered, "Thank you." That was the last time she spoke about the house. A week later, Walt helped me box up the rest of what we wanted to keep. The place had too much history for either of us to pretend it was just a home. The sheriff came once, mostly to follow up on the old missing person records. I'd mentioned the contractor, the boy. He asked questions that didn't have answers, wrote things down, promised to check state files that probably hadn't been opened since the late 90s. He didn't go into the basement. When he left, he told me some houses just hold on longer than they should. I think he meant it kindly. I stayed one more night before locking up for good. My mother had gone to live with her sister down in Winona near the river, and she seemed lighter for it. Walt drove her there, said she slept the whole way. Before they left, she pressed something into my hand, a folded note. It was the letter she'd written to herself after Jason vanished, the one she'd never mailed to anyone. It was short. "I think he's still here," it read. "But I don't know what that means anymore. I didn't either." That last night, I sat by the furnace one final time, the letter folded beside me, and pulled out the small red coin I'd found on the basement floor, the one Jason used to carry everywhere. I turned it over in the lantern light, expecting it to feel colder than it was. It didn't. On the back, faintly etched into the plastic, were 3 words I'd never noticed before. "You are remembered." I don't know if they were always there or if the house had given them back to me. Either way, I believed them. By spring, the farmhouse was sold to a young couple from Duluth. They had a little boy, maybe 7, the same age Jason had been when we built snow forts by the barn and raced tin can cars down the drive. I told myself they'd fill the house with new noise, laughter, running feet, all the small sounds that make walls forget the old ones. I left a note on the kitchen counter with my number just in case, but they never called. I don't think the house needed to breathe anymore. It finally had people to live inside it again. Months later, I got a letter in the mail, no return address, just my name in a careful, unfamiliar hand. Inside was a photograph. It was my family's old living room sunlight pouring through the window, and on the mantel above the furnace was the framed picture of Jason I'd left behind. Only in this photograph, his smile was different. It wasn't the gap-toothed grin from the school photo. It was softer, older somehow, like the way I remembered him when I closed my eyes. On the back of the picture was written a single line in pencil. "He's home now." I keep that photo in my apartment propped against a lamp where it catches the morning light. Sometimes when I wake before the city noise begins, I can almost hear that old furnace hum, the low, steady rhythm that used to fill the farmhouse at night. It doesn't scare me anymore. It's the sound of a place remembering what it once held. Walt passed away 2 winters after we sealed the tunnel. He'd been splitting firewood when his heart gave out quick and quiet. His daughter called to tell me, said he'd left a note in his truck addressed to me. It was just a few words scribbled on a scrap of paper. If the house ever calls again, let it rest. I think he knew I still dreamed about it sometimes. As for the others, the sheriff never found new records on Michael Holbrook. It's as if the man never existed past the last service invoice my father signed in '97. But I think of him often, how he must have stood in that same cold basement decades before me, hearing the wall breathe, trying to make sense of something too old to explain. He'd written "Let It Forget" in his journal. I understand that now. Forgetting for some things is mercy. Life moved on the way it always does, quietly, almost rudely so. I went back to work, spent my days in hospital rooms, holding the hands of people trying to make peace with their own ghosts. Every now and then, I tell a patient's family that sometimes the body remembers what the mind can't, and when I say it, I think of that house, that wall, the names carved into stone, and the way the air felt after we sealed it. Lighter. Like a breath finally let go. I visit Briar Lake every fall now. Not the house, just the town. The diner's still there, still serving the same pie that's more crumble than crust. The lake freezes sooner than it used to, and the trees seem smaller somehow, or maybe I'm just older. From the hill you can see the farmhouse roof line through the trees. The new owners painted it white, and in the evenings when the sun drops, it glows faintly the way snow does under moonlight. Sometimes I stand there long enough to see the porch light flick on. It's a good light, steady warm. A sign that someone is home, someone still keeps the heat running just in case. I don't think about what's buried beneath it anymore. Not in fear, not in denial, just in peace. The house held on to what we couldn't bear, and when it was done, it gave back what it could. That's all memory really is, a way of carrying what's too heavy until you're strong enough to set it down. I still dream of Jason sometimes. In those dreams, he's not 8 years old. He's just there. Whole calm, standing in the doorway of that warm kitchen, his hair damp from snow, holding that little red coin between his fingers. He never speaks, but I wake up knowing what he means. He doesn't need me to look anymore. He just wants to be remembered the way he was laughing free before the silence came. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for pity, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because somewhere out there in another quiet house or forgotten place, someone is still listening for the sound of a familiar breath. And sometimes remembering is all it takes to let the past finally rest.